Now we're going to look at natural selection a little more closely. Natural selection is so effective because it is not random. It selects for beneficial traits and selects against harmful ones. You have probably heard of the phrase, survival of the fittest. This is true, but we need to redefine what fitness means. When you hear the word fitness, you probably think about strength and exercise. Maybe you picture bodybuilders lifting weights. But in biology, fitness means something completely different. Fitness is each individual's contribution to the gene pool of the next generation. Individuals can contribute to the gene pool by having babies that survive and then have babies of their own. So when we say the word fitness, we are really just talking about having children, reproductive success. The picture compares two birds. On the left, this bird only has 2 children, and each of those birds only have 2 children of their own. So this bird has relatively lower fitness. The bird on the right has 4 children, and each of its 4 children also has 4 children on their own. So the bird on the right has a much higher fitness. The bird on the right has more individuals in the next and then the next following generation that share its genes than the bird on the left. Organism's genes determine its physical traits. The organism's physical traits are what are under selective pressure because they are what interact with the environment. The physical trait could be something like the fur color of a mouse. If you look at the graph on the top, we can see a population of mice ranging in color from light white all the way to gray, all the way to black. There are more medium-colored mice, the medium to dark grays, in the population than there are white-colored mice or black-colored mice. So the mediums are what we call the intermediate phenotype, so this gray color. The white and the black are the extremes. Natural selection could affect this population in 3 different ways: directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. We'll go through each one. Directional selection favors only one of the extreme traits. If the mice live in an environment that maybe it's a lava flow, that is a black environment, then the black trait, the black extreme, would be the most favorable. Over time, the population would change from the original population with white to black mice to this new population, where most of the mice found are darker colored. You can see that the entire bell shape curve shifts from the left to the right. Stabilizing selection selects for the intermediate trait, and it selects against both of the extremes. This might happen if the mouse lived in an area of mostly grayish rocks. The black mice and the white mice would both stand out and be easily seen on the rocks, but the gray mice in the middle would be relatively camouflaged, and they would be selected for. You can see that the bell curve here, instead of shifting one way or the other, gets narrower and taller. An example of stabilizing selection is human birth weight, so the birth weight of babies. Almost all babies are born somewhere between 5 to 10 pounds. We select against both extremes. Babies that are born smaller than 5 pounds are often very underdeveloped and sometimes die. We also select against large babies. Babies that are born more than 10 pounds often cause complications during birth that can lead to death. Nowadays, it's much more common if your baby is large to have a C-section to help avoid some of these complications. The last type of selection is called disruptive selection. It is the opposite of stabilizing selection. In this case, both extremes are favored, but the intermediate is not. This could happen if the mice lived in an patchy environment that had both black areas and white areas, but no gray areas. Maybe white sand with black rocks. Then the white and the black mice would be able to find areas that suit them. but the gray mice would stand out everywhere and be selected against. So in this case, the bell curve dips in the center and gets larger over both extremes. We have more white mice, very few gray mice, and more black mice. Sexual selection is natural selection for certain traits that are more likely to get the individual mates. Some species of animals show sexual dimorphism. These are distinctive characteristics other than the reproductive organs that distinguish male and female. One example of this is the peacock and the peahen. The male peacock has a beautiful tail that they use to attract mates. The female peahen is usually drab. Typically, the females of a species get to be choosy about mates, which is why the male animals tend to have more adornments. We can also see sexual dimorphism in humans. Females typically have enlarged breasts, curvy hips, and less body and facial hair. Men tend to have broad shoulders, deeper voices, and prominent facial and body hair. Darwin was confused by some of these traits because they do not necessarily seem directly related to how well the offspring will survive. Male peacocks, for example, have a huge plumage. Having this large tail makes it less likely that they can escape predators. The answer to this lies in what's called the good genes hypothesis. The good genes hypothesis suggests that females choose traits that tend to correlate with successful offspring. In one of the species of frogs, females prefer male frogs with long mating calls. The study showed that the offspring from males with long calls were larger and grew faster than the offspring from males with shorter calls. So this supports the good genes hypothesis. Similar to what we saw with insects exposed to pesticides, today we are seeing bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics. Antibiotics were not widely used until the discovery of penicillin, which was prominent in the 1940s. Before that, people could die from a scratch that became infected. Unfortunately, antibiotics select for bacteria that have developed resistance, and bacteria can share their resistance with other types of bacteria. Many misuses of antibiotics have led to the development of strains of bacteria like MRSA, which are resistant to most antibiotics. Overuse of antibiotics in agriculture and medicine have resulted in a lot of bacteria being exposed to antibiotics, allowing for natural selection to occur. When you have some time, take 15 minutes to watch the TED Talk about antibiotic resistance in our culture today. Balancing selection occurs when natural selection maintains the abundance of two or more phenotypes of a trait. One specific type of balancing selection is called the heterozygote advantage. A heterozygote is someone who has two different forms of alleles for a gene. They carry one gene for a dominant trait and one gene for a recessive trait. Sometimes this is more advantageous than having both dominant or both recessive traits. One example of a heterozygote advantage is sickle cell anemia. The sickle cell allele causes red blood cells to be shaped like crescent moons. These are not very good at carrying oxygen, and they tend to get stuck in joints and cause pain. They can also cause clots. Someone who has two copies of the trait for sickle cells are selected against because the sickle cell disease is very deadly. Someone with only one copy of the trait is considered a heterozygote. They have one copy for sickle cell, and they have one gene for normal blood cells. They usually have complications, but can survive. This is an adaptive trait if you live in Western Africa, where malaria is present. Malaria is a pathogen that infects blood cells, normal blood cells. Someone who lives in Africa without the sickle cell allele will have normal red blood cells and is more susceptible to malaria, another deadly disease. So this means that somebody who has both normal blood cell traits would be susceptible to malaria. So in areas where malaria is prominent, being a heterozygote and having one copy of sickle cell is an advantage because it helps protect against the malaria disease. Natural selection does not lead to perfection. Natural selection cannot make perfect organisms. It only selects for variation and traits that already exist. so it cannot invent new adaptations that may be better suited to an environment. Natural selection has to work within its historical limits. For example, birds are related to tetrapods, animals with 4 limbs. In order to develop flight, they had to give up the use of the forelimb to develop wings. Natural selection was not able to add an extra limb so that birds could still have arms. This is an example of a compromise also. Most adaptations make something better to suit the overall organism, but they usually have to give something else up. Fish are either slender, like tuna, or have big powerful jaws, like bull shark. You can't have both. The human knee is an example of a compromise. It was an adaptation to be able to walk upright because it is much more energy efficient. But the joint now has to deal with a lot more strain and is vulnerable to injury. Sometimes unpredictable random events occur that natural selection cannot overcome. If a storm disperses a population of insects, they may find an environment that they are adapted to, or they may not be mostly suited to that environment.